Thank you very much. The issue of nuclear weapon-free zones have been touched upon several times so far, during the introduction talks, during our NPT talks, and just this morning as in terms of safeguards and the role of ABAC. So these are agreements that have developed over time and very much grounded in the Latin American Caribbean region, and have served to make most of the world nuclear weapon free. And they date back to even before the NPT. The question that I have on my first slide, are they still relevant? And I'll come back to that at the end of the presentation. So I think it's important to understand what nuclear weapon-free zones are. All around the world, here in the United States in particular, but also, and I've seen some in Canada, I've seen some in Italy, and I'm sure there are many others. You see these signs. You come into a city, we have the city of Santa Cruz, just north of Monterey, that these are nuclear free zones, or some are nuclear free, others are nuclear weapon free zones. These are local or municipal declarations that you find in Europe or in the United States, and I'm sure there must be some in the Latin American Caribbean region. They are local declarations, and while they are of political significance, they obviously do not have any legal force or international recognition. But there are countries that also are nuclear free, Austria being one, that do not wish to have nuclear power in a particular country. But nuclear weapon-free zones are really internationally binding agreements amongst a group of states that effectively prohibit the development, manufacturing, control, possession, testing, and transporting of nuclear weapons within the zone, both by the regional states as well as by nuclear weapon states. That is the official UN definition. And like the NPT, nuclear weapon-free zones obviously permit peaceful uses and applications of nuclear energy under IAEA safeguards. The picture here, of course, is of Alfonso Castello Robles, who was Mr. Disarmament, and I'm sure Ambassador Bonzanini will talk about that a little bit more. But Ambassador Robles was a famous Mexican diplomat who served during the NPT negotiations in the 18 Nations Disarmament Committee. He served on the first UN General Assembly meetings on disarmament, and was instrumental in taking the idea from a nuclear weapon-free zone and I'll come back to in the next slide, to what then later become Tlatelolco. And for that, he won the Nobel Peace Prize. So the interesting thing about the establishment of the nuclear weapon-free zone concept, that it was tied to a number of international developments, very much tied to nuclear testing. My past experience, obviously, at the CTBTO is important in this context for me, because it highlights the importance of efforts by regional states to say to nuclear weapon states, enough, get out of our territories. And so this started way back by Prime Minister Nehru from India, who called for a standstill agreement, which then eventually, later on, became what was today the CTBT. But nuclear testing really peaked in the 1950s and 60s, and I know Ambassador Bonzanini will talk about that too. Interesting enough, the very first concept of a nuclear weapon-free zone originated in Europe. It was the Rapetsky plan, and the idea of a nuclear weapon-free zone right in the heart of the Cold War war zone, if you wish. And this was, of course, not successful, but it is significant that the idea came from there. But it really came to a point when the French tested nuclear weapons in Algeria in the early 60s. And the interesting thing about that is, of course, the African nations were outraged about it. It went to the OAU, it went to the General Assembly, and then, of course, that followed by a number of other events, including, in particular, the Cuban Missile Crisis. And obviously also the role of the OAS in dealing with that. Coming back to Ambassador Robles, Brazil was very much outraged also with the French test in Africa. And Ambassador Robles at that time was the ambassador to Brazil. And there became the idea of a nuclear weapon-free zone was conceived, and the Mexican president, not President Lopez of today, but President Lopez of back then, together with Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, and Ecuador, announced the intention to establish a Latin American zone. And then a number of other events took place, including, of course, the establishment of the NPT. And if you look in the NPT, Article 7 is very clear that nothing in this treaty prevents states from taking regional actions to completely ban nuclear weapons. So Tlatelolco was signed in 1967, a year before the NPT was in fact signed. I'm not going to go through all the detail in this slide. This is basically a chronological sort of representation of how nuclear weapon-free zones were developed. But after Tlatelolco, the model was there, and we see that the Treaty of Rarotonga was established in 1986. We see a number of developments that took place that allowed for states to start talking about nuclear weapon-free zones, in particular when the United States closed its bases in the Philippines. South Africa acceded to the NPT, and thereby allowing the African nations to push for a long, from 1961, they've had this desire to establish African nuclear weapon-free. And there was an announcement also by the Uzbek president that a Central Asian nuclear weapon-free zone will be established. In the mid-90s and the 2000s, we really saw progress in this field. Particularly the NPT Review and Extension Conference agreed to indefinitely extend the NPT, but it was part of a package, and one of a crucial part of that package was the resolution on establishing a Middle East weapon of mass destruction-free zone. And we will come back to that later on. But importantly, the Treaty of Bangkok was signed for the Southeast Asian states. The Treaty of Pelindaba was signed for Africa. And then Mongolia declared itself nuclear weapon-free as well, which is a very interesting concept, a single-state nuclear weapon-free zone. And then finally, the Central Asian states signed the Treaty of the Central Asian Nuclear Weapon-Free Zone, and also the Pelindaba, and that treaty entered into force in 2009. So that's really a very, very brief history of the establishment of these zones. But there are specific criteria, and it's important to understand these criteria because they relate to international law, and they relate to also how nuclear weapon states treat nuclear weapon-free zones. Clearly, a state and a regional or a group of states can declare themselves free of nuclear weapons, but without the cooperation of those states with nuclear weapons, that declaration is merely symbolic. And so the General Assembly in 1975 recognize that there needs to be a definition. And this also was recognized by the first special session of disarmament in 1978, where the now famous phrase come from that nuclear weapon-free zones should be established on the basis of agreements freely arrived at among the states of the region concerned. And they came up with 6 important points. In addition, from the states in the region, obviously this must be legally binding. Clearly, there must be a total absence of nuclear weapons. And there's been some variance to that. It must have a verification and control system, the IEA safeguards. It must have a centrally and a clearly defined zone. It can't be a loosely group of states from all over the world. And it must be recognized by the General Assembly. And so all the zones that have been established over the years have focused on those 6 points. In the United Nations Disarmament Commission, and for the young diplomats who may not be aware of the Commission is a deliberative body established by the General Assembly that is supposed to meet every year in New York, and they focus on topical issues. It's a deliberative body, it's not a decision-making body. But ironically, the last time that they could find agreement on nuclear issues was in 1999. I was actually fortunate to be a diplomat in New York myself and participated in those negotiations. So this is a more elaborate version of what the General Assembly already defined, but I wanted to highlight a few elements here. That nuclear weapon-free zones should also be respected by all states, not only nuclear weapon states, outside the region. This becomes tricky when it comes to territorial claims on territories. So we had a question earlier about the Malvinas. So the question could be, is the Malvinas inside or outside the Tlatelolco Treaty? Diego Garcia in Africa is another example of that. I'll come back to that briefly. There must also be that obligations under existing regional international arrangements must be respected. In international law, you cannot have an overlap between treaties. One treaty cannot change what another treaty's obligations are. And so, given that many, especially given that we're after the end of the Soviet Union, especially in the Central Asian states, that there were treaties that were agreed to when, for instance, Kazakhstan became independent, and there are some discrepancies between those treaties and existing arrangements. Again, there must be clearly defined boundaries, and very importantly, that these zones should not prevent the peaceful uses of science and technology. The UNDC also looked forward, and this was important, especially given the agreement just 4 years prior to on a resolution of the Middle East nuclear weapon-free zones. And so it's a strange word to be used in a UN document, vigorous cooperation, but I recall long discussions about that. But the idea here was also new. You have the nuclear weapon-free zones from all over the world, but the concept of cooperating amongst themselves was recognized. And in fact, every year, and I hope that there will be a conference prior to the review conference next year, nuclear weapon-free zones and countries come together as parties to nuclear weapon-free zones in an own conference that kind of sets up their agenda for the NPT, and it's a powerful group of states, if you can imagine. They're also important that, and this is I'll come back to this point, that nuclear weapon-free zones can be expanded and consolidated in the context of ultimate goal of eliminating nuclear weapons. I'll show a few maps again soon, but if you think most of the southern hemisphere is somehow linked, either through oceans that the nuclear weapon-free zones expand over, or in case of closer territories. But also the expansion is important, and I'll come back to that. And clearly the recognition, and this was a consensus document. Again, it was not binding, but the international community recognized that the nuclear weapon-free zones, the aim is to achieve the ultimate goal of a world free of nuclear weapons. So I mentioned, without the support of from nuclear weapon states, nuclear weapon-free zones will be simply a political statement of intent, because those states in the region must be nuclear weapon-free already, because they're all members of the NPT, they all have safeguards in place. So the United States have published principles that, these 7 principles that they use to evaluate a nuclear weapon-free zone. And other nuclear powers have similar ad hoc, or review nuclear weapon-free zone establishment on an ad hoc basis. I personally participated in the final round of negotiations of the Pelindaba Treaty, and the United States and all the weapon states were present. They were not there to negotiate or block negotiations, but they were there during the whole process, and therefore had opportunities to weigh in if they felt that the weapon zones would go in directions where they couldn't support it. However, and I must be very clear with this, that did not deter the negotiators from taking certain actions. I would only want to highlight the 2 in yellow, because the rest are basically the same as the criteria by the United Nations. And point 4, that the zone should not infringe on existing security arrangements or the right of states to self-defense. Now, this very much relates to NATO and the nuclear umbrella. So that's why it will be highly improbable if there's a nuclear weapon-free zone in Central Europe or in Western Europe. The nuclear weapon-free zone in the South Pacific, that includes obviously Australia. There are specific arrangements that are made, but Australia obviously is also covered under the nuclear umbrella. And then 6, which is another important and controversial point, is that the zone should not affect the right of states to grant transit or overflight. And of course, the US flies bombers loaded with nuclear weapons all over the world. And this also has a particular a relevance to the Treaty of Pelindaba, given the US base in Diego Garcia. There is a close relationship between nuclear weapon-free zones and the NPT. Obviously, the NPT recognizes in Article 7 that states have the right to establish regional arrangements to declare that regions completely free of nuclear weapons. But the NPT only prohibits the control of nuclear weapons by states. But nuclear sharing and the prohibition of any deployment is not in the NPT, and it deliberately was not included in there. But this is where nuclear weapon-free zones come in. They ban the placement of nuclear weapons. So even if you are a close ally to the United States, take Australia for instance, the United States cannot place nuclear weapons on Australian territory. Nuclear weapons, US nuclear weapons are on the territory of countries such as Germany and the Netherlands, and that is the concept of nuclear sharing. And this is rather controversial in the NPT discussions, because these are non-nuclear weapon states. Nuclear weapons also reinforce non-nuclear weapon states' obligations under Article 2 and 3. We've already heard both Tariq and Irma excuse me, talk about that. And the comprehensive safeguards agreement is a standard for verifying also nuclear weapon free zone obligations. In the case of the Central Asian zone, now the comprehensive safeguards as well as the additional protocol have become a standard. And this is an interesting point that I also want to emphasize. If we look at the individual zones, there's a steady progression on the different obligations as they developed over years. And so the Central Asian zone is kind of the most modern zone, and therefore also have the highest level of verification of any of the other zones. As mentioned already, it's nuclear weapon-free zone is a route towards achieving complete nuclear disarmament as envisaged in the NPT Article 6. It complements the NPT that it enhances confidentiality, confidence building measures, transparency, negative security assurances. So nuclear weapon states, in terms of all the zones, are required to promise by signing a protocol to the zones that they will not use or threaten to use nuclear weapons against any of the zonal states. Another controversial point. But nuclear weapon-free zones can only be effective if they are recognized by the nuclear states. And therefore, all the existing zones have treaties have protocols that require signature by nuclear weapon states. And these are legally binding. And in particular, these protocols focus on testing, that nuclear weapon states are not allowed to test on the territories of the zones. They are not allowed to place their weapons on the territory of the zones. Those two are pretty straightforward. We have a test ban treaty in place, although it's not in force yet, but it's highly unlikely for the United States to resume testing in the Marshall Islands. This is now independent countries. Or for the UK to again test in the territory of Australia, and so also is unlikely the placement of nuclear weapons. However, the threat of use of nuclear weapons remain a controversial point. And the interesting thing is that the United States in particular, their nuclear posture have evolved. And so during the Obama administration, the nuclear posture is every sort of 8-10 years, the US administration review its nuclear weapons posture. And the Obama administration's posture on negative security assurances was that the United States would not use nuclear weapons against non-nuclear weapon states that are members in good standing of the NPT. Of course, you can debate on what good standing means, but the Trump administration changed that basically to say that are in compliance with their nuclear non-proliferation obligations. This goes beyond the NPT. So you could very well argue that Iran is in good standing with the NPT. Iran has not developed nuclear weapons. But you can argue that in case of the United States view, that Iran may not be in compliance with its non-proliferation obligations, and therefore Iran could be a target of US nuclear weapons. So it's a very dangerous loophole in this. This chart just shows the linkage between nuclear weapon-free zones, nuclear weapons, and also nuclear testing. And so the areas in brown are covered nuclear weapon-free zone treaties. Obviously, the red are nuclear weapon, or orange are nuclear weapon states. And then there's these little dots, like little atomic signs on countries. Those are actually the Annex II states of the CTBT that are required to ratify that treaty before it enters into force. So it shows you just the correlation between nuclear weapon-free zones, nuclear weapon states, and the CTBT. All right, I'm going to go very briefly over the existing nuclear weapon-free zones. This is a map created by the Office of Disarmament Affairs in the United Nations. It also identifies other nuclear weapon free zones, and that's the Outer Space Treaty, excuse me, the Seabed Treaty, and the Antarctic Treaty. They are also legally binding, and states are not allowed to place nuclear weapons there or test them. Currently, there are about 119 countries that are covered under the nuclear weapon free zone treaties, and you can see that is most of the Southern Hemisphere. Treaty of Tlatelolco, Ambassador Bonzanini are going to talk in detail about this. All I want to point out here, obviously it was the first nuclear weapon free zone treaty, but all the protocols have been ratified by the weapon states, but there is no restriction on the use of the high seas. There is a treaty called the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea that protect the international use of international waters. And as you can see, this the zone has been defined by latitude and longitude lines that goes much, much further than the territorial waters of the zonal states. And of course, it also includes the Malvinas. But I will leave that to Ambassador Bonzanini to discuss in more detail. South Pacific Nuclear Weapon Free Zone, this is an area that was bombarded by nuclear tests by the United States and France and the UK, and that specifically drove those states to define a nuclear weapon free zone in that region, and therefore it was also the first nuclear weapon free zone that banned testing. The interesting thing about this, though, is that while the treaty has entered into force, the three protocols have not all been ratified by the nuclear weapon states. The countries of the UK and France have ratified the protocol requiring states not to place nuclear weapons there. But none of the other nuclear weapon states have done so, nor have the United States ratified the treaty, the protocol that require them not to test in that region. So it begs the question, do these countries plan to place nuclear weapons on any of the small island states in that region or test again? This is a really dangerous discussion. I must, however, also emphasize in the case of the United States, it's also linked to the fact that the Senate is controlled by the Republican Party. The Republicans were famously voted down to give consent for the ratification of the CTBT and are not in favor of multilateral treaties. But recent statements by the Trump administration does beg the question, if the United States resume testing, would this in any way or form be done again on territories outside the United States? Treaty of Bangkok, very important treaty given its location. It borders obviously China, and it is also very close to North Korea. Another new element in this treaty is that it bans the dumping of nuclear waste, as well as research and development on nuclear weapons. But it also includes the economic zones. And so clearly the geography of the region would imply that the economic zones between states, this is outside the territorial water of a state, but it allows the economic use of the waters, including fishing. And if you look closely, then of course, the Malaga Straits, this is one of the heaviest trafficked areas in the world in terms of marine traffic. In terms of this treaty, the states can decide by themselves whether they would allow passage of foreign vessels through that zone, including vessels that potentially carry nuclear weapons. And so nuclear weapon states have not been willing to sign the protocols on this treaty, including the protocol not to on negative security assurances. Discussions have been held between the zonal states and the nuclear weapon states for decades on this issue. Then the treaty that I personally feel strongly about and have been involved with is the Treaty of Pelindaba. Pelindaba, by the way, is a Zulu word that says the matter is over. It's been discussed and it's closed. And so it was, that's also the name of the site where South Africa's nuclear weapon enrichment took place. But the Pelindaba Treaty also has two new elements, and it prohibits weapons research, and it mandates a program reversal. In fact, if you read the treaty closely, you could actually have nuclear weapons at the time of signing the treaty, but you have 180 days to have safeguards in place, meaning that you basically have 180 days to get the nuclear weapons out. And this was done with the idea that when the negotiations started, that South Africa may have nuclear weapons and that would give them time to get rid of them. South Africa obviously got rid of the nuclear weapons before the treaty was signed. Here again, the protocols show that that many of the nuclear weapons, some nuclear weapon states have not ratified it. And then finally, the Central Asian Nuclear Weapon Free Zone, the most modern one. This requires the additional protocol as well as compliance with the CTBT as a standard. But controversial because the Treaty of Tashkent between Kazakhstan and Russia allows the transit of nuclear weapons, potential transit of nuclear weapons over the territory of Kazakhstan. None of the protocols have been ratified, but there's another very interesting element of this treaty. And I mentioned earlier the potential expansion of nuclear weapon free zones. And so this treaty allows for future expansion. You may very well ask, well, where do you want to expand to? Because you have, of course, Afghanistan is there, but you have Pakistan on the one side, you have obviously Russia on the other side, you have China. So where do you want to expand to? What would be the most logical state that you want to include in the Central Asian zone? And that, of course, is Iran. And it does beg an interesting question. And I would like to be part of that discussion one day if it happens. If Iran decides to contact the Central Asian states and say they want to join that treaty. And of course, I will talk about this now, about the nuclear weapon free zone in the Middle East. But it opens up a very interesting question. Where is Iran closest affiliated to Central Asia or the Middle East? So, as I mentioned from the outset, there are a number of other nuclear weapon free zones. Mongolia, notably, a very interesting one. In fact, there's also a de facto zone in East Central Europe that's linked to the 4+2 Treaty on German Reunification. When the GDR became part of Germany, unified Germany, the agreement between Bush and Gorbachev was that there would be no foreign military forces placed on the territory of the former East Germany. So de facto means that US nuclear weapons cannot be placed on that territory. And of course, there are a number of countries that have national policies about the deployment of nuclear weapons on their territories as well. A number of zones have been proposed. Unfortunately, they have all been fallen away, but the main discussion today focuses on the Middle East. And this was a zone originally proposed by Iran and Egypt, going back to the early 70s. It was reinforced through the NPT, and the NPT, in fact, the NPT parties in 2010 agreed that there should be a conference held and a facilitator appointed to move this forward. This all fell apart, and in fact, the US and the UK withheld support from the final document of the 2015 review conference, causing that conference not to be able to adopt a final document about language that would put the responsibility of convening a conference in the hands of the Secretary General. And such a conference was held, but it was not with strong support from, or any support from the nuclear weapon states, and of course also not from Israel. But again, what would a nuclear weapon-free zone in the Middle East actually look like? There's a variety of definitions. There's a definition on the zone by the IEA, there's a definition by the General Assembly. Clearly it should have as part of it the League of Arab States plus Israel and Iran. But then the question begs, what about Turkey? Is Turkey part of the Middle East? And of course, Turkey must be part of it, but Turkey is a NATO state with the potential of having nuclear weapons on it. What about the overlap with the Pelindaba Treaty? Because Northern Africa are part of the League of Arab States, and so there you have to be careful that the obligations already established under the Pelindaba Treaty are not limited by a new treaty. And then very much the continental shelf, again, if you look at the Suez, the Red Sea, the Suez Canal, you know, and you know, the Gulf of Oman, these are all areas where there's heavy marine traffic. Some special prohibitions that it will have to include, obviously a declaration on dismantlement. One cannot imagine, if ever Israel would decide to join a treaty, that Israel will announce that it had nuclear weapons. Israel has been silent on that since the 60s, and an announcement that it would have nuclear weapons would have serious, obviously, political repercussions. Issues of dumping of waste, security and physical protection, and a mutual notification mechanism. And Irma's point earlier, I think, is a very important one about verification and compliance. There has been a traditional mistrust in the IEA. I see Tariq is online and George as well. They may want to comment if they wish, but you know, Iran has had this love-hate relationship with the IEA, and so much so is Israel, because obviously Israel will not open Des Moines to the IEA. And so the question then is, if there is such a zone, would there be sufficient trust in the IEA to allow it to be the sole verification agency? And I think here, Irma referred to it, that the model of Abak could serve as an example of a potential regional body in the region. And then in terms of the role of nuclear weapon states, when it comes to security assurance, this is an interesting one. So if you can imagine you're Israel, you're considering, this is a hypothetical case, but you're considering to join a nuclear weapon free zone, and you want to make sure that you would not be the target of nuclear weapon states' weapons. Are you going to be concerned about the United States or the United Kingdom or even Russia or China? No. Will you be concerned about Pakistan? I think yes. And so then it comes up, you know, how do you, is Pakistan recognized as a nuclear weapon state under the NPT? Of course not. And then, of course, the relationship with India comes in. So it is an interesting discussion. Of course, there are existing security arrangements between the United States and Israel, for instance, and how would that be impacted? But there are major obstacles to the zone. Israel is not a member of the NPT. It has a suspected nuclear weapon program, and it is highly doubtful that Israel will at any time soon agree to join the zone. I would also dare to say that I don't think the United States will allow Israel to do so. I think it's in the United States' strategic interest to have a opaque nuclear weapon-free, a nuclear state in the region. But it's also important that the mandate for the zone is not only nuclear. it is a weapons of mass destruction and delivery system free zone. And so countries such as Israel, Egypt, Syria are not parties to the Biological Weapons Convention. And we know that Syria joined the Chemical Weapons Convention, but there are continued examples of the use of chemical weapons in Syria. Of course, there's the ongoing Arab-Israeli conflict, and then it comes to, is there an alternative? And I will wrap this up by saying, there are alternatives. And I think the important thing that nuclear weapon-free zones have shown is that they have disarmed the disarmed. With the exception of states in the Central Asian zone where they had nuclear weapons, returned those weapons to Russia, and South Africa's case where weapons were dismantled prior to the zone, there were no nuclear weapons in any of the other zones. So that, this is coming back, are they still relevant? So this is a hypothetical model, but if there to be a nuclear weapon-free zone in Northeast Asia, basically it would be North Korea, South Korea, and possibly Japan. This could serve as a confidence-building measure, allowing discussions to a point where North Korea could potentially, give up its nuclear weapons. There could be security assurances given to both North Korea, South Korea, and Japan, and could facilitate a grand bargain between North Korea and its neighbors, and obviously other states. However, I think it's too late. I think North Korea is beyond the point where it can be convinced to give up its nuclear weapons. We're going to have a discussion on this on Monday. But it is, as far as other zones in the future, I think it's more conceivable, at least in my opinion, for a zone in Northeast Asia than a zone in the Middle East. And that's the end of my presentation.
Okay. Well, thank you, Mr. Dupre, and you have already presented a very insightful. May I go on?
Yes, there's just one problem with with the sound. There's like an echo. Yes, Ambassador Bonzanini.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Mr. Dupre, you have already briefed.
I'm sorry, Ambassador.
A very insightful overview about the existing nuclear weapon-free zones and how, to some extent, they were inspired by the efforts carried out more than 50 years ago by a group of Latin American countries concerned by the risk of a nuclear confrontation at the height of the Cold War. Now it's my turn to address the relevance of the Treaty of Tlatelolco and the nuclear weapon-free zone established in Latin America and the Caribbean. I'll start my presentation by recalling some important historical aspects of the treaty, and then I will briefly mention the main provisions of the treaty and move on to highlighting the continued relevance of the nuclear weapon-free zone, non-proliferation regime. In the second part of my presentation, I will share some perspectives on the future of the nuclear weapon-free zones that, in my opinion, are the most relevant. On the historical part, I'd like to recall that in 1962, nuclear tests reached their peak with approximately 120 atmospheric and 60 underground detonations. On 15th November 1962, 1 month after the missile crisis in the Caribbean, Brazil, Bolivia, Chile, and Ecuador submitted the draft resolution AC1L312 revision 2 to the UN General Assembly, containing a proposal for the denuclearization of Latin America. A year later, in 1963, the 5 presidents of Latin American states, Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, Ecuador, and Mexico, issued the Declaration on the Denuclearization of Latin America. By means of said declaration, the 5 presidents announced that their governments are prepared to sign a multilateral Latin American agreement whereby their countries would undertake not to manufacture, receive, store, or test nuclear weapons or nuclear launching devices. In November, the United Nations General Assembly addressed this initiative by adopting Resolution 1911, which expressed the hope that states of the region will initiate studies aimed at achieving that goal. This multilateral agreement, the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons in Latin America and the Caribbean, the Treaty of Tlatelolco, was concluded on 14th February 1967 in Mexico City, only 4 years after Resolution 1911 was adopted. The text of the treaty, as I mentioned earlier, reflects the concern of our region about the risk of a nuclear confrontation at the height of the Cold War. And as it is the case with all international instruments, the provisions of the Treaty of Tlatelolco should not be interpreted in isolation. In the preamble of the treaty, which is neither rhetorical nor decorative, we'll find the connection of the treaty with the surrounding political conditions at the time of its inception, or the aims of the treaty. The field of nuclear weapons, strengthening the world at peace, total prohibition, and weapons of mass destruction of any type, general and complete disarmament under effective international control, preventing the proliferation of nuclear weapons, keeping peace and security in the military denuclearized zones, use of nuclear energy exclusively for peaceful purposes, right to the greatest and most equitable possible access to this new source of energy in order to accelerate economic and social development. Finally, and this is probably the most important part of the preamble, it clearly states that military denuclearized zones or nuclear weapon-free zones are not an end in themselves, but rather a means for achieving general and complete disarmament at a later stage. These aims are the route map of the Tlatelolco Treaty and of its 33 states parties. In regard to the body of the treaty, I will briefly mention its more relevant provisions. Prohibits in Article 1, Paragraph 1, the testing, use, manufacture, production, or acquisition by any means whatsoever of any nuclear weapons, directly or indirectly, within the zone of application. And it also forbids the receipt, storage, installation, deployment, and any form of possession of nuclear weapons. Moreover, in the same paragraph, the treaty commits its contracting parties to use exclusively for peaceful purposes the nuclear materials which are under their zone of application. Article 4, Paragraph 1, of the territories for which the treaty is in force. And the territory is defined in Article 3 as the territorial, sea, airspace, and any other space over which the state exercises sovereignty in accordance with its own legislation. Article 4, Paragraph 2 expands the zone of application beyond the national territories, notably the exclusive economic zones and the high seas. The interpretive declarations to Protocols 1 and 2 to the Treaty of Tlatelolco, made by France and Russia, concern this maritime zone of application. However, the zone of application complies with the 1982 United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, and it does not claim sovereignty nor jurisdiction over these zones. The total zone of application covers 10 square kilometers. Regarding the interpretative declarations to additional protocols 1 and 2, the 5 nuclear weapon states maintain interpretative declarations Article 2, Paragraph 1, Section D of the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, which reads, D, reservation means a unilateral statement, however phrased or named, by a state when signing, ratifying, accepting, approving, or acceding to a treaty, whereby it purports to exclude or to modify the legal effect of certain provisions of the treaty and their application to that state. Pursuant to Article 28, Tlatelolco does not allow reservations, a clause expressly accepted in Article 4 of Protocol 2, whereas Protocol 1 deliberately omit this matter. The reservations of France and Russia challenge the scope of the zone of application. As I mentioned, the second paragraph of Article 4 of the treaty delimits the zone of application, including areas of the high seas. The security of the states in the nuclear weapon-free zone was the purpose of the negotiators, and thereby of the treaty. Nations Conference on the Law of the Sea, which led to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, 1982, UNCLOS, had not yet been convened when the negotiations conclusion and entry into force of the treaty took place. The reservation therefore revealed the insecurity of those two states regarding the evolution of a negotiation that was coming. Yet it was, and still is, mistaken. In Article 4 and everywhere else in the Tlatelolco, it is inexistent, both in the letter and in the spirit, the intention of sovereignty or jurisdiction in the high seas over which the UNCLOS has basically kept the Grotian concept of mare liberum. What the law of the sea convention did not alter in the extension of the coastal state jurisdiction, which, by the way, has been accepted by France and Russia, but kept the nature and the ensuing regime of the high seas. Control system. The Treaty of Tlatelolco established the first international monitoring and verification system to ensure compliance with disarmament and non-proliferation obligations. System is verifying A, that devices, services, and facilities intended for peaceful uses of energy are not used in the testing or manufacture of nuclear weapons. B, that none of the activities prohibited in Article 1 of this treaty are carried out in the territory of the contracting parties. And C, that explosions for peaceful purposes are compatible with Article 18 of this treaty. Under Article 13, parties shall negotiate implementation of IAs after the ratification of the treaty. Moreover, under Article 14, parties shall submit to OPANAL and the IAEA semi-annual reports stating that no activity prohibited under the treaty has occurred in their territories. The Secretary General, with the approval of the Council, can request special reports under Article 15 and Article 16. The Council may request the IAEA to put into operation necessary mechanism for a special inspection. Treaty of Tlatelolco, organization. Article 7 establishes the creation of an organization to ensure the compliance with the obligations under the treaty. The Agency for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons in Latin America and the Caribbean, OPANAL, is composed of the General Conference, the Council, and the Secretariat. The General Conference is the supreme organ of the agency and meets every 2 years and extraordinarily if it considers necessary. The Council is composed of states and meets every 2 months, ordinarily as it considers necessary. Finally, the Secretariat and the staff. External relations of OPANAL. OPANAL is the oldest regional mechanism on nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation, and until recently, the only one to maintain permanent institutional relations with other multilateral organizations. The agency is always invited to participate at the first committee of the UN General Assembly and is listed among the organizations to be consulted for the submission of reports requested by the UN General Assembly to the UN Secretary General. With regards to the IAEA, relations are expressly stated in the treaty, and so is the case with the Organization of the American States, including inter alia and annual participation in the Committee on Hemispheric Security. The agency also participated occasionally in the Conference of Disarmament. Importance of the treaty. Why the Treaty of Tlatelolco is important? Well, there are several reasons of why the Treaty of Tlatelolco, the Treaty of Tlatelolco is the first legally binding instrument, which also creates the first nuclear weapon-free zone in a densely populated area. Second, the treaty establishes a set of provisions which grant rights and obligations to its states party regarding the development of nuclear energy. It also represents the first practical expression on the prohibition of nuclear weapon law, Article 1st. The Treaty of Tlatelolco is the first multilateral instrument including the definition of nuclear weapons, Article 5, whereas other treaties establishing nuclear weapon-free zones refer to them as nuclear explosive devices. Even more, the Treaty of Tlatelolco precedes and goes beyond the Treaty of the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, NPT, which, as you have heard throughout this week, is the cornerstone of the nuclear non-proliferation regime. The Treaty of Tlatelolco greatly influenced the inclusion of Article 7 of the NPT that gives the right of any group of states to conclude regional treaties in order to assure the total absence of nuclear weapons in their respective territories. Moreover, the Treaty of Tlatelolco establishes an international organization in order to its parties, which is full operational and is completely devoted to the issues of nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation. The Agency for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons in Latin America and the Caribbean, OPANAL. Finally, but not least important, the treaty is also respected by the 6 states parties to the additional protocols, those being China, France, the Netherlands, Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States. In conclusion, OPANAL has been in continued operation for more than 5 decades. Moreover, in accordance with the Treaty of Tlatelolco, the ultimate goal of OPANAL is the pursuit of general and complete nuclear disarmament. Both the Treaty of Tlatelolco and OPANAL remain as benchmarks of good practices and lessons learned for the rest of the nuclear weapon-free zones in the world, as well for the processes aimed at creating new nuclear weapon-free zones, such as the one in the Middle East. But this is something that I will later address when we talk about some of the perspectives about the future of the nuclear weapon-free zones. For the second part of my presentation on the perspectives on the future of nuclear weapon-free zones, I would say that there is still much potential for further advancement in the strengthening and consolidation of 5 nuclear weapon-free zones in Mongolia. In my opinion, there are 4 priority areas in which the existing nuclear weapon-free zones could pursue further efforts. First, I would say that the strengthening and consolidation of the norm is critical. Among the existing nuclear weapon-free zones, Latin America and the Caribbean is the only one that has achieved its universalization, and the zone of application became fully enforced. Although it's not an easy quest, for instance, it took more than 3 decades with the ratification of Cuba in 2002 to our region to achieve this goal. It is something that the zones should continue promoting efforts. Another relevant aspect of this area is the issue of additional protocols to the treaties establishing nuclear weapon-free zones. Contrary to the other nuclear weapon-free zones, the 2 additional protocols to the Treaty of Tlatelolco have been signed and ratified by the 5 nuclear weapon states and the Netherlands. These 2 areas represent windows of opportunity for collaboration, and OPANAL could work with other nuclear weapon-free zones in order to support their efforts in strengthening the norm in the regions. Second, there still is the need for an institutional development of the nuclear weapon-free zones. Currently, only 3 out of the 4 nuclear weapon-free zones have some form of institutionalization, but the creation of such follow-up mechanism is still a great challenge for cooperation and coordination with other zones. Among the 5 treaties establishing nuclear weapon-free zones, only the treaties of Tlatelolco and Pelindaba created institutions to ensure compliance with the obligations established by those treaties. OPANAL by the Treaty of Tlatelolco and the African Commission on Nuclear Energy, AFCON, in the case of the African nuclear weapon-free zone. OPANAL can also share its experience regarding the creation and establishment of an entity or institution in charge of the compliance of the treaties. Third is the issue of information exchange and cooperation with other nuclear weapon-free zones. The geographic distance and particular political concerns of each of the 5 existing zones in Mongolia do not change the common goal of pursuing a world free of nuclear weapons. This situation, however, does not necessarily facilitate regular information sharing on past experiences and future perspectives of belonging to such international regimes. In 2005, by OPANAL initiative, it was held the first conference of nuclear weapon-free zones. In 2009, the nuclear weapon-free zone in Mongolia. In 2010, a second conference took place on the eve of the 8th Nuclear NPT Review Conference. Both conferences were held by Latin American Initiative, showing OPANAL leadership. These 2 conferences were followed by a third in 2015, coordinated by Indonesia, And the fourth conference this year, coordinated by Mongolia, but postponed to 2021 due to the COVID-19 pandemic. These initiatives, although very hopeful, have not yet succeeded in generating a true dialogue among the nuclear weapon-free zones. However, we try to maintain contact with our sister zones. We are currently discussing concrete ways to formalize interregional cooperation with the African and with the Central Asian nuclear weapon-free zones. Finally, in the establishment of other nuclear weapon-free zones, it might be difficult, but it's worth to pursue efforts towards that end. The convening on November 2019 of the first session of the conference on the establishment of a Middle East zone free of nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction is a step in the right direction. OPANAL was invited to participate at this first section, and it will attend to the second session if invited. Nuclear weapon-free zones are a dynamic reality. Since 1967, with the advent of the Treaty of Tlatelolco, 5 zones have been created. This means that it's possible to go further and creating others to include the Middle East and the Korean Peninsula, for instance. OPANAL would like to see the creation of further zones free of nuclear weapons. Thank you all for your kind attention. Thank you.
Hi, I just want to know your opinion, Mr. Dupree. Do you think it is feasible for some Middle Eastern countries to adopt individual nuclear-free status, like, for example, Mongolia, in order to advance the regional nuclear weapon free zone, the free zone of weapons of mass destruction? I'm sorry. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you for the question, Daniela. It's certainly an interesting one. I remember the establishment of the Mongolia single state nuclear weapon free zone pretty well. And it was not without controversy because people were asking, well, what does this mean? A single state? Of course, any state that controls its own territory can decide for itself whether to allow nuclear weapons or not. The important thing about Mongolia, though, is the location of Mongolia. And if you look at Mongolia being wedged in between two nuclear weapon states, Russia and China, and then kind of at the tail and on one end links to the current Central Asian zone. It's really important where it's located. So it's not only symbolic, but it's politically very important. So to come to your question, yes, it is possible for any state to do so. Will it be practical? I don't think so. I mean, I would say the first state that would come to mind, if you really want to prove yourself to your credentials as not going to establish a nuclear weapon, it would be Iran. To declare itself a single state nuclear weapon free zone. The reality, it will never happen because the Iranian approach has so far been one of pushing and pushing back against what is now perceived as efforts to limit its rights, its peaceful rights to nuclear energy. But it doesn't mean that it is not possible. As I said earlier, I would rather see an expansion of the Central Asian zone by including states of the Middle East, as opposed to a single state zone in that in that region.
Thank you, Jan. The next question is from Luis Enrique. Luis Enrique, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Bonzanini and Mr. Dupré for the excellent presentations. And my name is Luis, I'm a diplomat from Brazil. I have two questions. First, Mr. Dupré mentioned the challenge of establishing a nuclear weapon-free zone in the Middle East, especially because one of the reasons was the de facto nuclear weapon states outside the scope of the NPT. And I was wondering, what is the treatment given by the Treaty of Tlatelolco to these de facto nuclear powers, which are outside the scope of the additional protocols? And my second question is, how is compliance by the nuclear weapon states with the additional protocols to Tlatelolco verified? Thank you.
I think Ambassador Bonzanini would be best suited to answer both those questions.
Okay, thank you very much. I will ask my assistant, Mr. Alain Ponce, who is research officer at OPANAL and has a Master of Arts in Non-Proliferation Studies at Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey, California. And he will answer those two questions. Please, Mr. Alain.
Thank you.
Hello, Alain.
Thank you,
How are you?
Ambassador. I'm not sure if you can hear me. Perfect. So yeah, I will try to answer to both.
The first one. Alain, I think.
The first one, what is the treatment given by the Treaty of Tlatelolco to these de facto nuclear powers? Well, by the time the Treaty of Tlatelolco was negotiated, conceived, and entered into force, well, both India and Pakistan, they were not nuclear states. So it was not particularly close or treatment under the regime conceived and established by Tlatelolco. And basically it depends right now the treatment of every single country. I mean, for every single country in Latin America and the Caribbean, they are still called to join the NPT as non-nuclear weapon states. So this is something that remains in most Latin American and the Caribbean foreign policies. Regarding the second question about how the additional protocols are verified, well, the two additional protocols, they were conceived like, if you just take a brief look at both protocols, the preamble part is basically equal. The only difference resides in the other articles, but it remains only a voluntary, well, not voluntary, but the nuclear weapon states, they commit not to violate. They conceive this respect for the state of the nuclearized area of the Treaty of Tlatelolco, and contrary to the Tlatelolco Treaty, which conceives a verification mechanism, in the additional protocols there is no verification mechanism foreseen. They are just like five articles, and just the compromise of the nuclear weapon states and those states that have de facto or de jure territories in the area to not to contribute in any way to violate the spirit and the letter of the Tlatelolco Treaty.
If I could come in there, Paula, I mean, first of all, Elaine, very good to, I was trying to turn your camera on, but good to hear you. I think we'll see you later on in the video, but it's good to hear alumni of the Monterey College speak. And on that point, I would like to emphasize that CNS and OPANAL have had a long-standing arrangement. We've had several interns. Then I can't remember whether you were an intern there, but that we have been fortunate to place at OPANAL over the years. So Ambassador Bonzanini, thank you for those opportunities for our students as well. I want to make sure on this point, and I fully agree with Elaine's point, that there is no way to actually verify compliance. And there's also no way to force the nuclear weapon states to sign on to those protocols. And the de facto states as well. And this has been an ongoing problem for most of the nuclear weapon-free zones. In the case of Tlatelolco, as Ambassador Bonzanini pointed out, all the protocols have been ratified. But in the other cases, there are several that have not been. And it's not only the nuclear weapon states. For instance, in the case of Africa, Spain has been refusing to sign and ratify the protocol on the fact that it claimed territories on the coast and off the coast of Morocco. And so obviously Spain has no desire to place nuclear weapons there. That's not the point. It's an issue of territorial integrity of the zone. And so despite long negotiations and consultations with these states, those areas remain, unresolved. So
I think we'll have the final question for this segment is from Shakira de la Vega. Shakira, you have the floor.
Hi. I thank you for an excellent presentation, Ambassador Bonzanini. And it's good to see you again. I'm Shakira de la Vega from the Bolivian Embassy. I would like to ask you, maybe can you elaborate more about which are the two most important challenges and opportunities of the increasing role in the nuclear weapon-free zone for you? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mrs. Shakira, and for this question. And I would like to elaborate. It gives me the opportunity to elaborate a little bit more. And I would like to mention some proposals with this purpose. First, we would expect that the fourth conference of nuclear weapon-free states in Mongolia in 2021 could not only reiterate the common position of its 115 participant countries, but also adopt arrangements in order to make contact and collaboration among them. Second, on an information exchange, OPANAL considers vital to have a regular exchange of information and past experiences. Thus, a focal point or person for each zone and informal gatherings on the margins of the UN General Assembly or the NPT meetings could be of great help for increasing our influence in order to reach the common goal of a world free of nuclear weapons. Third, at the UN General Assembly, currently every nuclear weapon-free zone submits individual resolutions, which are regularly adopted, some of them without a vote. A joint annual resolution at the UN General Assembly of all nuclear weapon-free zones could be tabled, we think. This initiative could help for greater coordination and to present a common front in the strengthening of the regimes established by the treaties and the very concept of such zones. It could also be of help to the establishment of future nuclear weapon-free zones. Fourth, on the comprehensive study on the questions of nuclear weapon-free zones in all its aspects, OPANAL would consider very positive that a new study be undertaken. The only document available dates back to the 1970s. In that regard, a new study could be requested by the UN General Assembly. Fifth, regarding cooperation with the UN and the UN Office of Disarmament Affairs, although it is true that some contact and cooperation have been registered among representatives of nuclear weapon-free zones and United Nations, it's necessary to improve it and to have a direct engagement. There is a need of permanent contact and greater cooperation to facilitate the exchange of views in order to coordinate future efforts. Sixth, on the organization of future conference of state parties, it might be useful also to strengthen the preparatory process. Well, summing up, I think we should all keep pushing. That's, I think, is a very important message I'd like to convey. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. We actually have an extra question. It's from Pablo. Pablo?
Hello, good morning. Thank you very much for the great presentations. My question is regarding if you can provide us some comments or ideas about the potential role of negative security assurances in terms of the nuclear weapons-free zones. And for example, or could be one of the potential attractions for the countries in the Middle East to create in the future a nuclear weapon-free zone. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pablo. And how are you, my good friend? I'll take a stab at that. And before I do so, I also actually want to present a question to Ambassador Bonzanini, and that is regarding his points now about the conferences. I was fortunate to attend two of those conferences, the first two. And it was a great initiative by OPANAL to start them. But I would be curious, after responding to Pablo, your views on why the third conference was not successful. I was really disappointed that it could not reach agreement, and what you think the prognosis is for the fourth conference. But to come back to Pablo's question. Pablo, I think it's more a question of positive security assurances more than negative ones. Positive security assurances are assurances given first and foremost by the Security Council. There are Security Council resolutions that state that the Security Council will immediately come to the assistance of states that are threatened or attacked by nuclear weapons. Then there are also positive security assurances given by nuclear weapon states to their allies. And so in the case of Israel, the assurances between Israel, or the US and Israel, go back to decades and decades ago, even during the Kennedy administration, and during those years, including during a time when Israel supposedly started its nuclear weapons program. So one can argue that positive security assurance to a country such as Israel, should it give up nuclear weapons, because it would have to join a nuclear weapon-free zone, could potentially could serve as an incentive for Israel not to have its own nuclear deterrent, but to rely on an extended deterrent of the United States. And that obviously could serve the same purpose for any other country in the region as well. A negative security assurance to countries in the region would have to come from obviously the United States and the other nuclear weapon states, just as it applies in any of the other existing nuclear weapon-free zones, because countries, especially in that part of the world, would want to be assured that they will not be the target of nuclear weapons of states with them. As I mentioned in my presentation, however, I find the practical implication of that rather challenging, because if a country in the region have nuclear weapons, I'm not talking about Israel, would it become a target of the United States, for instance? And so that would obviously, first and foremost, the fact that that country has nuclear weapons would violate the nuclear weapon-free zone. So I think there's a bigger problem in this issue, and that is the issue of the relationship with Pakistan. And so to negotiate a treaty, if there is to be a treaty in the Middle East, that would require, would not require states outside the NPT, in the case of the nuclear weapon states, to provide security assurances, whether they are positive or negative, would, in my view, limit the assurance that a country such as Israel would get against the use of nuclear weapons. You will have to include a country such as Pakistan. And I mean, I don't want to go into all the detail about the concerns that Israelis have over Pakistanis and vice versa. I mean, these are much bigger political issues. But if I were to be in Israel, I would fear more of the potential being a target of Pakistan. Then I'm going to ask I don't want security assurance from France. I don't want France to target me. I mean, or Russia. So, I think it's a complex issue, but I would, as I said, I would move the question more to how the role of positive security assurances could be an incentive to countries in the region. I don't know if Ambassador Bonzanini, if you have some thoughts on that.
Well, Mr. Alain Ponce will respond to the question about the perspectives of the fourth conference and why the third conference didn't work as it was expected.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for giving me the floor, and the participants. And just like to briefly continue in the line of what Jan was saying. Yeah, the thing about the negative security assurances is one of the most important for the nuclear weapon-free zones. For instance, this is like practically the backbone of the Treaty of Tlatelolco, and the additional protocol by which the nuclear weapon states, they compromise to not use or threaten to use nuclear weapons against any part of Tlatelolco, which is basically the essence of these negative security assurances. Regarding the issue on the conference of states parties that creates nuclear weapon-free zones, I mean, unfortunately, this was this failure in 2015 because of the procedural elements regarding the recognition or not by some about of Western Sahara and all the dispute between two of the state members of the Pelindaba Treaty. This is something that was a little bit more addressed for the 4th Conference of States Parties. However, given the fact that this conference was postponed for the next year, and still we're waiting for the resolution that will approve the dates and convene the conference, but still I think, or we think here at OPANAL that this conference has much potential to succeed in comparison to 2015. We've been following the consultations in New York and trying to contribute to the final document of the conference, and we still see some window of opportunity for that conference to become a successful story, a necessary successful story for next year. So thank you.
Thank you, Alan. If I could, Paula, just maybe comment on that. I think it would be really useful. I've been thinking about this for a while. That these conferences, and I say this in all respect to, especially coming from a former diplomat's perspective, but the conferences tend to sometimes be a talk shop. There's a lot of statements made, and then there's an attempt to come up with a declaration. And as you correctly pointed out, the last conference failed to do so because of discussions on non-nuclear related issues. But I would really think it would be useful if states of the existing zones could come up with a series of lessons learned and guidelines or recommendations on the establishment of new zones based on the experience of the existing zones. And because I think that would serve as a powerful message to other zones, but also obviously to the nuclear weapon states. And this might be something that could be something for OPANAL to drive, if I may be so forward to suggest something like that. Especially, Ambassador Bonzanini mentioned this, the issue of universality I think is a key issue. Tlatelolco sets the example. Yes, it's completely universal. I know I was very much involved in trying to get, in achieving the entry into force of the Pelindaba Treaty. But we still have a large number of African states that have not yet ratified. I'm not talking about Egypt, but we understand the problem with Egypt in the context of the Middle East. There are a number of other countries that can be that still need to ratify the treaty. And I think OPANAL's involvement, and I'm aware of the consultations with AFCON, but it could be really important to move all the nuclear weapon-free zones into a complete universal system, which would make the whole of the Southern Hemisphere and large parts of the Northern Hemisphere truly nuclear weapon-free. Okay, I don't see any more questions, Paula.
No, well, I don't see any, but I just wanted actually to thank you both, Ambassador Bonzanini and Jan, please, for your presentations. I think they were really useful for our participants. So just wanted to thank you before we move ahead with the program.
Okay, thank you. And thank you, Ambassador Bonzanini. Thank you very much for participating.
And thank you also for your very valuable suggestion. We'll take care of it and we'll move on. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Sandra, thank you.
Now it's time to move forward for our virtual tour and presentation of OPANAL. It's going to be a video recorded, so I'll leave it to you.
All right, I will attempt to do this. Paula, do you see the screen?
Yes, yes, I do.
All right, let's see. And just let me know if you can't hear it.
Okay.
Good?
The Agency for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons in Latin America and the Caribbean is an intergovernmental organization established in 1969 with the purpose of overseeing member states' compliance with the Treaty of Tlatelolco. The Treaty of Tlatelolco, and therefore the agency, is constituted by the 33 countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. OPANAL has its headquarters in Mexico City. The Treaty of Tlatelolco establishes the agency's three main bodies: the General Conference, the Council, and the Secretariat. OPANAL is the only regional organization in the world devoted entirely for the achievement of nuclear disarmament and the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons.
Article 11 of the Treaty of Tlatelolco establishes the Secretariat, the Secretary General as the Chief Officer of OPANAL, and of such staff as the agency may require. The staff is appointed by the Secretary General in accordance with the rules of procedure of the General Conference. The Secretariat convenes the meetings of the Council and the General Conference. It also submits reports on the status of compliance with the obligations of the treaty, on the activities of the Secretariat, and on the international debates on nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation. Our current Secretary General is Ambassador Flávio Roberto Bonzanini, who was elected by the General Conference on the 7th of November of 2019. As of today, the OPANAL has had 8 Secretary Generals.
The General Conference is the supreme organ of OPANAL. It is composed by all the 33 state parties and holds regular sessions every 2 years. The General Conference may also hold special sessions whenever the Treaty of Tlatelolco so provides, or in the opinion of the Council if the circumstances may so require. The General Conference decides on any matter covered by the treaty, including those referring to powers and functions of the organs established by the treaty. It also establishes procedures regarding the control system, elects the members of the Council and the Secretary General. It may mandate studies designed to facilitate optimum fulfillment of the treaty's mandate, and can authorize the conclusion of agreement with other governments and international organizations. The General Conference also approved the agency's annual budget, fixed the scale of financial contributions paid by member states, and may also establish subsidiary organs it deems necessary. Here in the archives, we guard all documents issued by the agency. Just take a look at this verbatim archive from the conference, from the first session of the General Conference held in November 6, 1972.
In accordance with Article 9 of the Treaty, the General Conference may establish such subsidiary organs as it deems necessary for the performance of its functions. In this sense, the General Conference, in its third period of ordinary sessions, held on 1977, established the commit and contributions and administrative and budgetary matters.
The CAC is the advisory body to the Council on Financial Expenditure. It reviews, analyzes, and formulates recommendations regarding the budget and scale of financial contribution. It evaluates expense subject actions so member states can meet its financial obligation. Evaluate the report presented by the Secretary General in the financial situation of the agency and the implementation of the budget. It examined the financial statement certificate by the external auditor and guide the Secretary General in administrative and budgeting matters. Currently, members of the committee are Argentina, Belize, Brazil, Ecuador, and Uruguay. They were elected by the General Conference for the period of January 2020 up to December 2023.
The Council is formed by 5 member states, which are elected by the General Conference for a 4-year term. The presidency of the Council rotates amongst its members alphabetically every 2 months. In addition to the functions conferred to the Council of OPANAL by the treaty and those which might be assigned by the General Conference, the Council, along with the Secretariat, is in charge to ensure the proper operation of the control system established in accordance with the provisions of Articles 13 to 18 of the treaty in order to verify the following. 1. That devices, services, and facilities intended for peaceful uses of nuclear energy are not used in the testing, manufacturing of nuclear weapons. 2. That none of the activities prohibited by the treaty are carried out in the territory of any contracting party with nuclear material or weapons introduced from abroad. And 3. That explosions for peaceful purposes are compatible with Article 18 of the treaty. The current members of the Council are Argentina, Belize, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Uruguay.
A crucial function of the Secretary General is to ensure the proper operation of the control system established by the Treaty of Tlatelolco. I'm in charge of establishing the procedures for distributing to all member states information received by the agency from governmental sources and information from non-governmental sources that may be of interest to the agency. The Secretary General is elected by the General Conference for a 4-year term and may be re-elected for a single additional term. As established in the treaty, the Secretary General cannot be a national of the country in which the agency has its headquarters. One of the agency's main challenges is to strengthen our partnership with the 4 other nuclear weapon-free zones and Mongolia, which also is a nuclear weapon-free country. An important meeting of the 5 nuclear weapon-free zones and Mongolia will take place in New York next year, when new initiatives of cooperation shall be discussed.
We work for a nuclear weapon-free world.
Thank you very much to OPANAL for this video. We really enjoyed, and actually to see all the personnel from OPANAL contributing to it. Thank you very much.
Yes, I'd like to echo that. Ambassador Bonzanini, congratulations on a well-made video, and also congratulations for having so many young people, especially women, on your staff. That's fantastic to see. It's certainly an inspiration and an example for other organizations. But I also find that the whole interactive nature of this was really nice to see, and kind of certainly try to do this ourselves for future events. This was, as the young people would say, very cool.
So now I think we're ready to wrap up our session for today, and actually the last one for this week. From my side, we don't have any announcement now. I don't know from your side, Jan.
I just very briefly that there will be a few changes to the program next week. I will send you the change, but we will have, in fact, 1 or 2 different panelists and speakers as well. And then I will post the video recordings of this week. Hopefully by this afternoon, the Romero Institute will receive them. So they will be available on the course platform.
Perfect. So we will look forward for that, and actually look forward for next week, starting on Monday at 9:30 Mexico City's time. We'll see you back here.
Right. Have a good weekend, everyone. Goodbye, Ambassador.
Hi, Ambassador. Thank you very much.